Good afternoon and welcome to this very special event. We are very proud to host this afternoon here in Uppsala, Sweden. This is Nordic Africa Institute, for those who haven't been here, which is a Nordic research and documentation center for Africa, modern Africa, concerning social and economic development. We are very happy to cooperate today with Diakonia Sweden and Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, who have shared this wonderful visit with us. And I will just welcome you here, and then my colleague, our South Africa researcher Annika Teppo, will introduce our guest. But okay, I can tell you the name already. His name is Naidoo. And as far as I understand, he's in Sweden after 27 years. So we welcome him, and not only Sweden, because this is Nordic Africa Institute, so we welcome him from all Nordic countries. Enjoy the event and make sure that you make very good questions. Thank you.
Hello and good afternoon, Jay, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Annika Teppo, as she said, the head of the Urban Dynamics Research Cluster here at the Nordic Africa Institute. And, you know, having spent most of my adult life researching South African questions and issues, it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker. So anyone who knows little about South Africa, and even those who don't, have heard of Jay. He's a man of many hats. A revolutionary and a union man, or should one say a union man personified, who has witnessed both the rise of the draconian system of apartheid, as well as greatly influenced its downfall. He was the first General Secretary of COSATU, Congress of South African Trade Unions. He has held 2 ministerial positions and worked for a number of socially important organizations, such as Love Life Foundation, which brought HIV/AIDS awareness in South Africa, and for the Development Bank of South Africa, and now as a chairman of the board of GAIN, Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition. In fact, his merits and decorations are too numerous to list here. To me, he is and always has been a voice of justice and common sense. His knowledge of South African society is deep and thorough, and importantly, he was the minister in South Africa's first democratically elected government of national unity since 1994, and he was responsible for the RDP, also known as the Reconstruction and Development Program. After his political career, Mr. Naidoo has remained a critical voice and a sharp social commentator of the post-apartheid state and social condition. I think that he, if anyone, is going to give us a very interesting talk on the topic of achievements and challenges in post-apartheid South Africa. Jay.
Thank you very much, Annika, and it's a great pleasure to be back in Sweden. I did arrive in Stockholm the first time, and Magnus will remember this. It was around March, April of 1986, a very significant year in the history of Sweden and the world. And I was the newly elected General Secretary of COSATU, which was a federation of unions launched and born in the furnace of a state of emergency with very brutal oppression from not just the government, but from employers and from vigilantes who sought to destroy us as a movement. But we were defiant, we were militant, and we were committed to social justice. And I remember arriving in Sweden, the first time I've been in real snow. And we were dressed like we were going to summer. And it was March and bitterly cold. So we got our first introduction to the life of living in a wintry Sweden. But it also was very important for us because it was a year in which Olof Palme was murdered very brutally. And he was a legend to us, because he was unrelenting in his defense of social justice. He never hesitated to challenge power, and he certainly rejected the notion of a Cold War that made so many of our countries in the developing world but proxies for this big battle between superpowers. And in terms of South Africa, he was unambiguous in his support for the liberation movement, particularly the African National Congress, to which many of us were associated. But I think what I found fascinating as well is that solidarity was not just an individual solidarity. We met with our union colleagues here in the Swedish LO and TCO. We had differences on the issues of international affiliation, but not once did they ever question their support to us in terms of solidarity. We were trade unionists. We may have had nuances in our differences in our politics, but they always stood foot to foot, shoulder to shoulder with us. And that's something that we found extraordinary in the entire Scandinavian countries, that unquestionably the level of solidarity went far beyond the leadership to ordinary people. And I think that's a very important aspect of what we need to rekindle in the world today. The fact that we should care about people who are more vulnerable, people who suffer the indignity of human rights violations, of poverty, of inequality, that we should come back to a world that Olof Palme represented of building solidarity and social solidarity. For many decades, that word has been demonized. And I think for us today, as we sit at the edge of a precipice of dashed expectations for the next generation, whether those are the ecological boundaries we are about to step over, whether that's about joblessness in the world today, whether that's in the north or in the south, in the developed world or developing world, I think we need to bring back into the center of our global narrative the notion, the principle of justice, of human dignity, of social solidarity. And if we fail to do that, then what we do is sow the seeds of the end of the human species. That's the choice that faces us today. And so I go back to it and think that what was really important to us in those days was the person-to-person solidarity. It wasn't about money on its own. It was about workers in Swedish unions taking a decision to boycott or not offload goods that came from South Africa. It was about individual citizens going into a supermarket and saying, I will not buy oranges that are produced in South Africa. It was a powerful message that apartheid was a heresy, and that each one of us had an individual decision to make as to how we relate to the struggle for freedom in our country. And so I think that that's something that we need to reignite in our debate on the global narrative of development today. Because often that narrative has been reduced to a set of statistical, technical-driven solutions that are isolated, that do not empower people on the ground to solve their own problems, and that ultimately create a dependency rather than an empowerment. And I think the important reflections on the history of our struggle in South Africa was that when we discovered in 1976, when millions of us from what is called the 1976 generation went into the streets, and we felt that we were about to bring down apartheid, that we were invincible. And in fact, we were smashed. And we were smashed mainly because when we turned around, we found no one. We had left behind our parents, the workers, the women, the townships. We had left behind residents. And we spent the next 18 years building at the coalface. I went into the union movement, which was still illegal then. I stood outside hostels and factories for years on end. And the important lesson I learned was humility, that actually poor people have solutions. They are the most resilient you will find in the world. Can any one of us in this room imagine supporting a family on $2 a day? We cannot. So understand that there's a tremendous knowledge there. And when we learn to listen, then we found power. And that power was not thinking we were the leaders, but in fact, we were just the catalysts that could co-create a vision, that could help in building institutions, that could create tools and knowledge that people themselves were able to harness in order to win their struggles around their bread and butter issues. Not issues that, as intellectuals and middle classes, we think are important, issues that people themselves consider are important. And a lot of discussion today where I talk to people around the world who are activists, in fact, their biggest challenge is that they so like to listen to their own voice, that they forget what their role is. And I think that's an important lesson to learn, humility and paying attention, that actually there are many solutions out there. We should find a way to scale them, to amplify them, and bring those voices with those solutions into the center of our debate. So it goes back to the principle that I believe that people are the single most important agent of change in any society. What we have to find is a way to link the intellectual or social or business capital of institutions like this to the streets and to the slums and the villages where the people are living, and connect the science to that struggle. And if you look at it, that's what brings change. In the last decade, the biggest changes in our world have come because people were fed up. Take the Arab Spring. Very simple, what are to many sort of development theorists, intangibles, like human dignity, justice, bread, which is jobs. These are what drove revolutions that brought down powerful dictators. This is what brought down the apartheid government. And I think that's, for me, the critical question. I think the second challenge that we face, I think South Africa could share with the world, is how do you manage a transition? And particularly in the context of what's happening now in North Africa and in different countries in transition. Because we still remain a political miracle. Undoubtedly, in 1994, sitting at the cold face of a confrontation, we sat at the edge of a precipice. We were, as the world almost expected, about to plunge into a racial civil war. And the question we have to ask ourselves, how did we step back from that precipice? And nothing takes away the enormous benefit and glory of that triumph over institutionalized racism. That remains a political miracle, and the most important part of that is it wasn't one big bang. There's a process. Apartheid sought to reform itself. I mean, the fact that in 1979 it opened up the door for legalization of black workers joining unions was an attempt to reform itself. We used that opening in order to build a very powerful movement that became a pillar of the resistance movement. I remember being accused in those days of collaboration. I was described as a collaborationist because we had chosen to register. But for us, it was a tactic, never a principle. The principle is that we had to destroy apartheid. So, when we are questioning strategy and tactics, it's very important that people who really are fighting the struggle determine that. And that's why, for me, I may disagree with people sometimes with what they're doing, but I'll never question their right to do it. And I think that, again, comes back to the question of humility, because we can all make wonderful critiques in hindsight, and we can all live in a laboratory where we can identify what we've done wrong. I mean, it's not rocket science in that, actually. It's very easy to do. But when you're in that moment, when you have to make choices, and where people's lives are at stake, it's a very different thing. So I think that the important lesson of transition is there's never a big bang. There's a series of multiple transitions. So if you look at the South African transition, what was the choice that faces us? And it's always about choices you make, where there was a strong opinion And when Mandela was released, and the violence that flared up in the aftermath of Mandela being released and organizations being unbanned was unimaginable. Hundreds of people dying a week. And the response of many people in our ranks was, we need guns to defend ourselves. But we chose, under Mandela's leadership, to say, no, we will suspend an armed struggle. We will sheath our weapons. You know how popular that made us? You know, go into a township where hundreds of people had died and you're telling them, put away your weapons? I mean, you're lucky to leave that place alive. That's the courage of leadership, to do the unpopular things, to swim against the current. But it was the right decision. Because we had two options. Either a scorched earth, or we go into a political settlement. And that political settlement remains to today an important element of, thank you. So there's some key examples for us as we contemplate in a very important center like this, understanding transitions, which are very important in the context of Africa in particular. How do we manage the many contradictions and conflicts in Africa? That if we look at it from 1990, the unbanning of of the ANC and banned organizations, the release of Mandela, to the setting up of CODESA, to the fact that we created a national peace accord that was more than a set of principles at the top, but tried to entrench different type of behavior by the security forces or by political parties. Whether that was the elections in '94, we only finalized our constitution in 1996. In fact, the last time that we completed the deracialization of politics was in 2000. So it took us a decade just to go through a transition of politics. And we went through many phases of that. And I think the most important element of what you can learn from that is, when did we decide that there was a shared interest between the two sides? Because there were two sides to this conflict. Many parties, but two sides. And it's when the constituencies and the negotiators decided that rather than representing constituencies and what constituencies want, like the white minority who wanted white minority protection, they wanted the veto right. It's when we overcame that and said, what is our shared interest of building a country, that we found the settlement. And that settlement ended up with a rights-based constitutional democracy that guaranteed individual rights, that had justice and dignity at the core of the Constitution, and that set up a process of transition around a government of national unity and what would govern the democracy in the first phase. So I think that democracy, in my mind, which we had in 1994, there are a few lessons. One is that we needed a glue that held us together. Now, that was something that I was responsible for. In the process leading up to the end of apartheid, we were all united by a very simple goal. We needed to end apartheid. And we needed to put into its place a non-racial, democratic, non-sexist South Africa, which would be a constitutional democracy. Now, what was the substance of that was a huge debate. But we had started off in the union movement before starting to say, if we are going to have an alliance with the ANC, we wanted it to be more than just defeating apartheid. We wanted to know what was going to replace it. So what morphed out of those discussions in the union movement was the notion of Reconstruction Pact, which eventually morphed into a Reconstruction Program that set out a vision, that set out the key pillars, and that set out certain targets. Okay, we go into government, we are the majority party, but we have a government of national unity. So we have to translate a manifesto that is an ANC manifesto into something that belongs to the government. Then we have to, having done that, and we didn't have a huge debate about that, we achieved that. Then the issue was, how do you implement this? Because we inherited a country that is bankrupt. 93 cents in every rand was already allocated to expenditure we could not change. So we had 7 cents in each rand to deliver this enormous shopping list of demands. And so we had to begin to change policies. change laws, change institutions, change the way the civil service is run, reprioritize the budgets. The difficulty of doing that was almost impossible to imagine. And this is the thing about it. It's so much easier, to fight for power than to exercise power. That's the challenge. And that's the challenge we continue to face. So if I think of some of the most important elements of what we did right and what we did wrong, and let me talk about the lessons of what we did wrong, I think that one of the biggest challenges we have is institutional capacity. Unlike many African countries, even though we were constrained by finances, we had an infrastructure. We had money. We're not dependent on donor aid to try and balance our books. So, did we have a capacity to deliver? No. We had a capacity of a civil service that knew how to deliver to whites, who were a minority, which had very little experience in delivering to the black majority. So we had to build that capacity. So we had to transform the organization, the institutions. And it's not so easy to just fire people and start, put new people in it. One of the impact of apartheid was a severe destruction of our human capacity. So we had to deal with that. I think the other notion that we came to grips with that we found really difficult was the notion of a democratic state, a developmental state. We had all gone into power believing that the development state was our main instrument to deliver. And so it was up to the government. And so we said, well, the government will deliver water, electricity, houses, jobs, telephones. And what we did, I think, as part of it, was make a massive mistake in that we made people bystanders. So people sat on the sidelines saying, we will wait for government. And then we found, really, government didn't have the capacity to take money and make it bricks and mortar. And so we ended up in a situation of relying on state-driven development when we knew that at the end of the day, we had to make people participate in the development that they wanted. And I think that's a very important lesson for countries going through transition. So I think that if you go through that process, let me jump to where we are today and what is the lessons 20 years later. Because we're like a teenager now, You know what teenagers are like. I think many of you have had teenagers or do have teenagers. They're like, they can be a bit difficult to control, unpredictable, angry sometimes, moody other times. It's like, hormones are driving behavior that is very difficult to understand and make sense of. It's noisy and it's messy. And so there are some worrying signs. I think the biggest worrying sign for me is if you look at some of the structural and systemic issues that we try to deal with, unemployment being one of the big ones, it remains persistent and it remains structural at about 25%. And that's in ILO definitions as people who are looking for jobs actively. So let me give an example of that. So if you take in 1994, say about 1.5 million young people were born. We call them born-frees. And they go to school in the year 2000. And so they come out of school in the year 2012. So let's look at that as one indicator and say, what's happened to them? Well, what we know is that about 700,000 write their final exam in the 12th grade, of which 75% pass. So somewhere along the line, between 500,000 and 700,000 have disappeared. They haven't disappeared off the face of the earth, they're there. So then you start asking yourself, what's happening in the system? Because at one level, we achieved the MDG target. Everyone has a right to go to school. No one can be refused admission in any school. Question no longer is what is your obligation as a state for enrollment. We should be looking at what is the quality of education. Because even of that 700,000 that are coming out of school, many of them have very few skills, no job, unlikely to have a job in their lifetime. So you've got to ask yourself the question, what's happening here? And South Africa's budget on education is bigger than many countries in Africa's total budgets. So there's a real problem happening here, because throwing more money at the problem doesn't solve the problem. We've got to talk about what's happening at the quality level. And I think that is one of our biggest challenges. If you start to look at the inputs, are people coming out with the idea that they're going to look for a job? Are they coming out with the skills that matches what is needed in the labor market? Are they coming out with entrepreneurial skills that help them set up businesses? Is the state providing the incentives that encourage young people to develop livelihoods? There's a huge challenge around employment. And that employment is what's driving a lot of anger today in the country. Frustration, because it's about anger, which we were when we were young, but we had a political cause. Today, people don't have that political cause. So the statistic tells us that there's close to 3 violent service delivery protests every day. So that's a problem. You've got to analyze it and see how do you deal with it. So is that different to what's happening in the world? You go to Spain, go to Southern Europe. The only difference is that the kids are better educated, but they still don't have jobs. So the question is that it's not a country problem, this is a global problem. And how do we deal with what are the factors that are changing even the nature of work? How do we understand technology? How do we understand what will be the growth part of the future? And what do we need to do in terms of education and training? And I think a second big factor which is worrying to many of us is corruption, the rising tide of corruption. We had a huge campaign in the Eastern Cape, our poorest part of South Africa recently, around corruption in the health system, because $100 million was found to have been stolen by government's investigations. The consequence of that is that many babies died because they weren't incubators, they weren't generators, they weren't vaccines, they weren't nurses or doctors. No one went to jail. So corruption becomes a huge factor in influencing whether we have stability in South Africa, but again, I could apply that to the world. The criminal negligence of banks that nearly caused the collapse of the global financial system that required trillions of dollars to be rescued. Did one banker go to jail? Yet millions of workers lost their jobs. So when we are looking at, are people taking responsibility for the right action, and are they paying the consequence of their right actions, is a big question. But I think in South Africa, the rising tide of corruption is causing a lot of conflict. And that corruption in a society which is not creating employment opportunities that create pathways out of poverty, then what happens is that people look at where will they get resources. And that's why there's such a fierce contestation within the political party. Because if you could become a leader of a political branch of the party, then you could become the councillor of the mayor of the local authority. Then you have your hands on money, on what the state procures. So you can see that in a society which is not creating those pathways, where people don't have a sense of political cause, where we're not producing enough skills that people find that they can create their own livelihoods, then they begin to look at other means to acquire. Nothing, it's natural. I mean, if you're hungry as a person and you see surrounded by corruption, why will you not take something to feed your children? Because isn't that about human dignity, able to put food on the table for your children? So I think that corruption is being driven by the sense of absence of opportunity, the absence of strong governance being brought to the center of the equation, and that rising inequality, which is what is our biggest contention in South Africa today. We have increased inequality under democracy must be a cause of concern for all of us, because it's unsustainable. And so I think the next battle lines are going to be drawn around issues of poverty, joblessness, inequality, not just in South Africa, but across the world. And then linked to that is that the form of deracialization of the economy actually never dealt with the structural concerns. It ended up with a type of empowerment that made a very small elite at the top very wealthy and did not address the need to build productive sectors of our economy. So at a certain point, what it causes is its own contradictions, that you can become incredibly wealthy overnight, that people who work really hard find that they have very little access to acquire or accumulate wealth. And so it creates a notion that you can get rich overnight. And I think that's been a very negative thing that happened. Should we deracialize the economy? Absolutely. Is it wrong that people acquire wealth in legitimate ways? No. Nothing stops you becoming richer than the next person. I think that at some point we have to have a debate about wealth and should there be a ceiling on it. Is it fair or just that 300 people in the world control more wealth than 3 billion? I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's just. Is it fair that a CEO should earn 300 times what the average worker earns in the company? No, I don't think that's fair. I'm prepared to have a debate about that. And that's what we should be. But in a society where there's such huge poverty and inequality, it's obscene to have that difference and discrepancy in wealth. So in my sort of concluding remarks, let me say, there are warring signs. I don't think that our political democracy is at threat. I think there are some worrying signs around the violence of protests. And I think that's a very important signal to us, because what does it show us? Marikana is one of the worst tragedies of our post-apartheid democracy. It is a massacre. And how did it arise? Because union members lost confidence in their leaders, lost confidence in their local political leaders, never had confidence in their business leaders, and they end up in a situation the only way they can get their leaders to listen is to use violence. And then violence becomes a language that the leaders listen to get their attention. And when that starts to happen at a large scale, then we are really got some worrying signs about a state not succeeding in keeping itself together. So we're still far from there, but it's something that will go down as one of the worst tragedies in our post-apartheid democracy. So that, the secrecy laws that the government is trying to introduce, which tries to clamp down, I think, essentially on the right of citizens to information, particularly information that exposes corruption within the state, is a very challenging thing. We have tremendous corruption in the private sector, corruption that has resulted in scandals, that are even collusion of companies around the price of staple foods like bread or construction. We have corruption in the civil society. Part of it is evident in what's happening in Kosoto today. So I think these are signs that are worrying, but also I'm positive about it, because I think out of adversity comes new movements. And that's why I'm never really sentimental about organizations. They come and they go. And I think what's really important is that there are new movements that have arisen. If you take the ARV struggle around AIDS, HIV/AIDS, what changed the policies of government is activism. And we're starting to see that activism rising. There are new movements. And I think they're very positive, and they need to be supported. And I think social justice has to be brought into the core of that discussion. And what's really worrying for us is the way in which our social justice struggles of the 80s were supported by the international community. And now in a world where donors are really focused on such technical outcomes, not understanding that real change in the society comes through us unleashing the social justice component of our struggles. That's what makes us deliver better education or better health or deal with corruption. So, and I think that's a balance we need to start to build. And so for me, movement towards political pluralism against an active citizenry is all part of what we should be working towards. And I just want to end up by talking a bit about Africa, because you can't talk about South Africa in exclusion to what's happening in Africa. And fortunately, South Africa doesn't consider it any longer part of Europe. So we're now part of Africa, which is a great, tremendous victory for us. But what's happening in the rest of Africa is of great concern to all of us. We're sitting at close to 1 billion people in the continent. Half of them are under 19. And all the constraints that face young people in South Africa face people in Africa. That they potentially could be our demographic dividend of the future. Because as we're looking at the demographics of the world, we will be 2 billion by the year 2050. By the year 2035, we are probably a bigger workforce than that of India or China. By the end of the century, we are 1/2 of the young people in the world. So if you look at that and you say, what asset this is, and you combine that with our assets of our mineral wealth, which is fueling probably 1/3 of the global economy, our land and water, which probably is 2/3 of the remaining arable land in the world, and you're starting to look at assets that are really powerful that we can begin to use to build Africa as the center of the 21st century. What we have to deal with is the issue of governance. And that's why I sit as a member of the Mo Ibrahim Foundation, which deals with governance in Africa, and really about measuring performance of our governments, who are the elephant in the room, and to deal with the issues in an integrated way of the rule of law, of human rights, of human participation, economic inclusion, of dealing with the question of whether it's workers' rights or rights of women. And we measure close to 94 indicators which are really about what is the life Africans have a right to, and how do we build the systems of accountability and transparency. And while we have a overall increased governance for the majority of people in Africa, albeit from a very low base, the gap between the top, which is like countries like Botswana, Mauritius, South Africa, and the bottom, Somalia, Madagascar, is just growing wider and wider. And what we know today from the data, which is 13 years of data that have been collected, is that violence and conflict is more intrastate than between states. We know it takes something like 20 to 25 years to recover from a civil war situation. What's the good news is that the post-war conflict societies like Sierra Leone, Liberia, Rwanda, Burundi, and Angola have made tremendous progress, still far from where the norm should be. And what we do know is that we've got to create pathways for young people. Because at the moment, employment, 9 out of 10 jobs in Africa is non-wage labor. 55% of the GDP of the sub-Saharan continent comes from non-wage labor. And we've got to find a way of a strategy that begins to put those people into the productive sector in a way that improves their livelihoods, improves their incomes. And a lot of the people in that sector, particularly in agriculture, are women. And as soon as we begin to empower women, we know that it's going to be a significant multiplier effect across the rest of the society. So, I mean, these are the issues that we face us. I think that we're going into a conference in Addis that brings together about 500 major decision makers from all parts of society in the next, in the middle of November. It's about trying to design the next 50 years of Africa. And I think what we want to do from the side of civil society, which includes the Mo Ibrahim Foundation and many other organizations, is try to make sure that we put citizens into the center of that trajectory. So thank you very much, and take any questions you have.